Hi, and welcome to the regular meeting of the Brisbane Planning Commission, Thursday, January 24th, 2013. Call to order.
Commissioner Cunningham?
Present.
Commissioner Doe?
Here.
Commissioner Parker?
Here.
Commissioner Reinhardt?
Here.
The record will reflect that Commissioner Munir is absent.
We are not going to now entertain a motion to adopt the agenda for tonight's meeting.
I motion that we adopt the agenda for tonight's meeting.
Second. All in favor?
Aye.
I would like to move on to the approval of the draft action minutes of September 27th, 2012, the regular meeting. Anyone have any changes to that?
No change.
I do not.
I was not. I was absent, so it looked in order from what I saw.
Thanks, Dave.
It's fine.
Anyone want to?
I'll make a motion to approve the minutes of September 27th.
Seven.
Thank you, 2012.
I second the motion.
All in favor?
Aye.
Okay, at this time, I would welcome any oral communications from our citizens and neighbors. Please come up and state your name.
Come on down.
Michelle Salmon, Brisbane resident. I don't know if the Planning Commission can help with this, but I was reminded of it again tonight on my way here, and that's the light pollution issues at Crocker Industrial Park and the Mission Blue Field. And it is just like sometimes brightest day there with the different lighting, and a lot of times the field lights are on when there's nobody on the field, and sometimes it looks like E.T. landed when you're driving down the highway and turn in to look towards Brisbane. And I don't know if the Planning Commission can take any initiative in asking for a light pollution ordinance that really has some teeth to it so we can get it turned down a little bit, and also maybe work on some other way of only lighting the field when it really needs to be lit.
Was there anybody there?
I couldn't see anybody, but then I was driving, so it's way far away.
I saw the light too.
Yeah, but I have gone by when there's nobody there and the lights are on. I've gone by in the pouring rain and the lights are on, and so it just seems like they must come on at prescribed times for maybe prescribed activities. I don't know. There's got to be a better way to deal with that. But the light pollution from the valley is intense.
It was pretty intense tonight.
Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you.
Can we ask about that? I live at the Ridge, and I can tell you we drive by there. It's not on all the time, but often enough when the fields are empty. It seems like, first of all, it's quite a bit of light, and second, it's expensive to light such a huge area when there's no reason for it to be lit.
In the building of Crocker Park have a huge amount of light.
I'll start. Well, certainly we can forward this observation or inquiry to the Park and Recreation Department. It is a city-managed facility, so I don't know what their rules are in terms of how long they keep it lit before or after the scheduled event or what their schedule is. But we can certainly make the inquiry and report back what we find.
Okay. And then the second part of the question is some kind of an ordinance or change in the lighting policy. Is that something that the city is looking at all?
To my knowledge, no, we're not. But if we're talking about the lighting of a public facility, you wouldn't need an ordinance for that. That would be a matter to be worked out with Public Works. I don't know what the schedule is as far as lighting of the ball field, but if it is on a timer or whatever, the proper one to be looking at that would be the city engineer and director of Public Works. And we don't need an ordinance to establish our own lighting standards in terms of when we want to keep it illuminated or not. And again, that would, as John points out, that would have to be coordinated with Parks and Rec, because I don't know what the schedules are for use of the park, but certainly at times when it's not in use, the city engineer could set the lighting timer so that the lights go off But there may be other reasons for illumination, such as public safety, and I think the police department would also have to be involved in that discussion.
Is there a question? Is there also a measurement of the lumens or the brightness of that when they do replacement on the bulbs?
Well, the illumination would be based upon the needs of the field as a recreational facility, which may be different than the illumination you'd use on a public street.
Right.
So again, I'll have to defer to the city engineer on that issue, but if you want to just raise the subject as a general topic of discussion, my suggestion would be for that thing to first be communicated to the city council. Even if there is an ordinance dealing with lighting, it probably would be part of our general public safety regulations and not a zoning or land use matter that would come to the Planning Commission.
So would the Planning Commission request that this could be looked into, that we think this is a great idea to look
The
into?
Planning Commission could certainly make a request to the city council to look into the issue, or the speaker can directly comment, to the city council during public comments as well, or as a written communication. The commission can always suggest to the council that they look at something. That doesn't mean if there is an ordinance, it's going to come back to you, but it's just a matter of general interest.
Well, it's very bright, and also, I can't imagine how much it costs to light this particular field. It's an enormous amount of light. In the Crocker Park.
We're actually talking about two different things. We're talking about properties owned by the city and then private property. And I know when we were talking about the property out in the Baylands where they're putting the parking lot, I mean, that was a big part of our permit, was that they had downlights to reduce the light pollution, and that's all the way out there, which is not annoying too many people right there. But in here, when I came down the hill, I noticed the same tonight. It was like, what's going on in Brisbane tonight? We've got so much light. Did you guys see it? It was pretty outrageous.
I was at
A
home.
lot of light.
Yeah.
Because the field is so bright, you probably didn't notice tonight, but Crocker Industrial Park and other areas of Brisbane have a huge amount of light pollution besides the field. So it's really two issues. One, our own management of our field and our light pollution. And then two, Crocker Industrial Park and other areas of Brisbane, which do have a huge amount of light pollution as well. And even if it's not in your direct line of sight, it does contribute to the overall light pollution in the night sky. And Crocker Industrial Park is often really, really bright without even the field lights on. So it's really two issues, and that's why I mentioned an ordinance, not just our own housekeeping issues about the brightness of our field lights and when they're on and not being used. So it's two things there. One is the industrial park, and getting the security lights all, pointed down and not creating so much light in the night sky. Thank you.
Thank you.
Just wanted to clarify that.
Does anyone else want to speak on for oral communications? Okay, I'm ready to close oral communications. Written communications, we have something from the Brisbane Baylands Community Advisory Group. We actually met January 15th, 2013. This was a notice that we were going to have a meeting. I think our next meeting will be in March. And something from the Heart of San Mateo. And that's it that I can see. And now I'd like to move on to items initiated by staff.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. I just want to take this opportunity to introduce Margaret Sahagi, and you'll be seeing her face, I suspect, at hearings related to the Baylands EIR over the time, so I didn't want her to be a stranger to you, and she can give you a little bit of some information about herself and her background and the role she's playing for the city. She is legal counsel to the city. Her clientele, she'll get into, is she only represents municipalities. She doesn't represent private developers through her practice. She's been providing CEQA services on the Baylands EIR in concert with the city attorney over the past several years. with the city attorney retiring, at least he thinks he's retiring at some point and will no longer be here, her services will be quite valuable in terms of providing a bridge from what's happened in the past and as the project moves forward. So it's a very valuable role in the process for us. So with that, I'll turn it over to Margaret.
Good evening, Chairperson.
Well, welcome.
Good evening.
Thank you. It's very nice to be invited and to be here, and I did not want to be a stranger. I have been working with the city over the past few years on an as-needed basis, or consulting with CEQA issues that are coming up with Brisbane Bayland. So I look forward to working with the city as you proceed with your public meetings at the draft EIR stage and then on to your more formal public hearing process on the project. As John mentioned in his introduction, I am a land use and CEQA attorney. I have a firm. I've been doing this as an attorney for about 26, 27 years, only representing public agencies. It's a position that I'm comfortable with. I started, my first career was as a city planner. So I soon learned that city planners need to understand land use and environmental laws as much as the attorneys, so I've kind of rolled the two things together. I love what I do. I spend a lot of time advising cities on a preventative basis, and that's what I view we're doing here. You know, how do you get through a process that's according to the rules and publish an environmental document that complies with CEQA? I litigate matters when they go that way too, but my love is to see that a city proceeds with legally defensible work and assist them in you and your role in doing that. So I'm looking forward to spending that time with you and the City Council and helping in any way that's appropriate. And I do know you've had some introductions. I know you had your CEQA workshops with Terry Rivas-Plata. I do a lot of teaching. Terry and I have taught before in the past. I teach at UCLA. I teach at USC Law School as well. I'm located in LA, but I practice throughout the state. I grew up in the Bay Area. I teach CEQA to the judges. I don't know if you know that CEQA is something that judges, it's a specialty, and the larger jurisdictions assign actual judges to hear CEQA matters, and they have to go to special CEQA school, which I have the honor of teaching with a couple of other colleagues. So I get a lot of insight as to what's going on from the judicial perspective as well, which is quite helpful. So I'm certainly available on an as-needed basis.
Can I ask some questions of the city, or would you like to?
I just said thank you.
Yeah. Welcome.
I have some questions for the city staff and also for the two attorneys. If we're having meetings, is one or another of these attorneys going to be present? And which one? Or do we know?
Well, I don't, with Hal's schedule being somewhat ill-defined at this point, I wouldn't be relying on him unless he really, really wants to. He's always invited, there's no doubt about it. I think there will be stages where legal counsel, particularly when the commission gets to the stage of deliberation on the final EIR, absolutely you will have counsel present. In the process, which is more, as we've talked about, information gathering, such as presentation of the draft EIR or public comment on the draft EIR, I wouldn't expect that legal counsel will be present. They'll have access to the same transcripts and the same records, and that wouldn't be part of their role, is to really weigh in on this sort of presentation and acceptance of information in any event.
Okay. Then I have a question I want to ask now that we have some legal advice available. When we accept people's comments, if it is not clear to us that, and we want more clarity for the person to make the best statement, can we get in there and actually ask for more clarification from the person who's making the presentation? I mean, it almost sounded as though we couldn't. I mean, we would certainly want, some people are not as articulate as others.
Yeah,
Some don't write as well as others.
I'll invite Margaret to disagree if she does, but I guess my feeling would be you can certainly ask someone to elaborate on their comment if you don't understand what they've said.
Right.
If you're trying to direct them into a particular place, then I think that is inappropriate. Your job is to simply receive testimony, and then it's the consultant's job to respond to those comments.
Right.
But if you don't understand the testimony, I don't have a problem if a commissioner or the commission asks the speaker to kind of clarify what they mean, so at least the comment is clear. Whether you agree with it or not, at least you know what the person is intending to say.
I would certainly agree, and if I understand your process, at that point you will have your environmental consultant present, and I think it's very important as well that they understand what the question is. So you may find that if something's not clear, they may be immediately asking for clarification, but
Also, I wanted to request, I did request rather a long time ago, but I would like to request again that maybe we could have some kind of a handout for people that would explain the best approach to have the best kind of questions so that it could be answered in a way that is not just simply a yes or no.
Could you repeat your comment? I was thinking you were headed somewhere else with this. I'm sorry.
I can answer it, because actually I watched bits of your the video presentation by Mr. Rivas Plata, the one on August 9th, and I recall that some of these questions and concerns came up on how do we get the best comments and responses to comments, and I did agree with Terry's response that it's very appropriate in the CEQA process. I think your original question was, well, I've read these documents and you get cited to a page in a section. And one suggestion to the community is, if there's a concern or clarification in their review of the document or your review, frame your question that way. Why is this model appropriate? But similarly, if it's already explained in the EIR, when you see those written responses come back, it is appropriate in standard procedure, and the law encourages it, for the consultants to say, please see air quality section, da-da-da-da-da. As far as helping you review a document, it may be that some sort of checklist of this is what you should look for when you're reviewing the project description chapter, might be helpful, just in sort of outline form. I don't want to step outside my lines here, but that might be something that would be helpful. Or what do you look for when you're reading mitigation measures? You may also find, when you look back over that PowerPoint presentation, that there's some helpful slides there. I always recommend, here's a couple of great slides that are user-friendly when you're reviewing a chapter. What's the terminology in a mitigation measure, for example. So I think there's probably some helpful guidance, whether it's written or continued to be verbal, that staff can provide for you.
And actually, I was talking to Margaret just today about that particular issue, and we do have on the website all the training sessions, all the handouts, but we did have a conversation about supplementing some of those materials, like a sort of a checklist of things to look for and other sort of examples of, mitigate our comments that are well worded and will elicit maybe a more productive response than other kind of comments that might not really elicit a very meaningful response. It's kind of do's, don'ts sort of information, and it's a matter of getting that online. So I suspect over the next 30 days in advance of the publication of the document, that sort of material will start to occur. And once we do have, I think, enough of it ready, we'll send out an email blast or blog it. So again, people who are interested in this can then go to that website and hopefully delve a little, get a little more information for their benefit.
And so if we do want to ask questions of Margaret, so
Sohagi, but just
Sohagi.
call me Margaret.
Then we would call the city and request the phone number, or,
We should use the staff as the primary contact.
Okay.
Everything's part of the, Margaret or Hal can talk about sort of administrative record and what that means, and communication between commissioners, what's on the record, and I think that's important. Maybe that's worth some conversation either now or another day, as to understand how your communications are sort of part of the record and what that means exactly.
Let me just also add, at some point, the city is going to have a successor to my position. I'm not quite sure when they're going to get there, but I have been promised that someone is being recruited at the moment. So even if Margaret is not available, there still will be a city attorney. Who that is going to be up to the city council. But at a meeting where I would normally attend, that's the city attorney who would be there, whether it's whoever it is. So it's not a matter of whether, because I'm retiring, there's not going to be anyone there. It's just a matter of who is going to be my successor, and then that person would be attending your meetings as well if Margaret is not there.
okay.
If I may, I just got a note from one of our city council members that the TV reception's not working. Is that correct?
We've received the same, and that's why Ken is gone, is to trying to rectify that.
Thank you.
Oh, jeez.
Sorry. Bring it up.
Any other questions that I may answer about my background or anything else on this agendized item?
So,
Thank you for being here.
I appreciate being here.
I do have another question. So, you said that you have been working for the past 5 years. Did you say that?
Oh, I've lost count. It's been on an as-need basis for the last few years when particular CEQA issues or land use issues have come up.
So you're very familiar with this particular EIR?
I am. I'm becoming more familiar with it day by day.
Great.
Does anyone else have any other questions?
No, that's great.
I look forward to seeing you. Thank you for your
Well,
time
We'll have
tonight.
lots in the future.
Yeah.
I really appreciate you coming and introducing yourself to the commission. New business? The next item is new business.
You might want to read the agenda.
So we will start with number 1, public hearing, zoning text amendment RZ-1-13 to amend Brisbane Municipal Code Title 17, Chapter 17.32.220, grading permit when required, to clarify the circumstances under which grading permits are subject to Planning Commission review, and to establish review criteria upon which the Planning Commission will evaluate grading permit applications. Applicant, City of Brisbane.
Yes, Madam Chair, members of the Commission. The document before you has been a subject of work for the city as well as Mountain Watch for a considerable period of time. What it represents is basically a major overhaul of the city's grading ordinance. The grading regulations are part of our building, chapter of the building regulations that would not normally come to the Planning Commission. The reason this is before you tonight is that there is one section of the zoning ordinance that you're aware of that allocates to the Commission the responsibility to review certain applications for a grading ordinance. The way it reads now is basically a very general application of whenever there is grading more than 250 cubic yards, I believe, of material. This makes no distinction of where that grading is occurring, whether it's in an area that's environmentally sensitive. It could be strictly an engineering issue. It ends up ending on your desk. And at times the Commission has been put in a very awkward position of being asked to render engineering judgments on matters that have nothing to do with planning. The main objective of the amendment is to try to change the focus of that provision so that certain grading applications for grading permits still come to you, but they come to you in the context of planning type of issues. So, for example, if it's part of an overall application for a PD permit or some other type of land use entitlement, which would come before the commission. The section that's being amended, is specifically in the zoning ordinance, is right at the end of this very long document, and it is section 1732.220 of the zoning regulations. To understand that section, you really have to go back to the grading ordinance itself. And let me, that's on page 44. Let me refer you back then to the ordinance itself to page 10. And that is the section that amends a similar provision that's contained in 1501. It's now 110. It was a different section before the amendment, where it referred to Planning Commission approval of grading permit. We've changed the language to read review of grading permit. We don't particularly want the commission in a position where you are approving a permit. That's an engineering judgment. It is within the professional expertise of the city engineer. The Planning Commission review of the grading permit deals with environmental type of issues. What is going to be the impact of the grading on the surrounding area, the appearance of the land after the grading is done? Are we dealing with habitat type of areas and issues that you are very customarily dealing with and familiar with and certainly able to handle, and it doesn't put you in the position of the city engineer of making a technical judgment on the sufficiency of the grading plan. Basically, there are two categories of applications that will come before the commission, and this goes back to the grading ordinance itself. Again, we still have the reference to 250 cubic yards, but we have defined it or limited it to certain areas of the city that is the subject of the grading permit. So it would either be in the Brisbane Acres, Southwest Bayshore, Central Brisbane, Northeast Ridge, Northwest Bayshore, or the Quarry. As you will see, these are basically the hillside areas of the city. And that the grading is being performed as part of a project for which an application for a permit is pending before the commission or other type of land use entitlement. So if all of those factors are present, then the application will come to you for review. There is a totally separate category of application that will also come to you for review regardless of the quantity of grading involved, and that is wherever the grading is to be performed within a parcel that's located within the Habitat Conservation Area, the HCP. It doesn't matter whether it's less than 250 cubic yards. If it's within the HCP, you have a chance to review it. The only exception to that, because we've expanded the definition of grading. Grading now includes clearing and grubbing, but that activity is already regulated through the HCP permit process. So that'll go to the county plan administrator for review. That work can only be performed pursuant to a site activity permit issued by the county. So if it's only clearing and grubbing, and for example, that's something that we normally would do as part of the city's weed abatement program up in the Brisbane Acres. So even though that's defined as grading, that would not come before the commission, but any other type of grading in the HCP would come before the commission. So we've got these two broad categories of grading permits that will be subject to commission review, and we've got the 250 cubic yards located within a certain area of the city and it's part of a land use development application, or secondly, if it's in the HCP. That's as far as the grading ordinance goes, and then there's also, has been added to that ordinance as well as to the zoning, the findings and the considerations that you are now being asked to make when an application does come before you. And here the grading ordinance is the same as the proposed amendment to the zoning regulations. And what that amendment does is it just lists things that the commission is to take into consideration when you do have a grading permit before you. And as you will see, these are primarily environmental types of concerns. Are we minimizing the impact on the natural topography? Is the grading going to avoid large retaining walls? Will it minimize removal of trees? Are protected trees going to be addressed? And considerations of the type that you normally would deal with on any type of land use application in the hillside area. So that essentially is the amendment that the Commission is making a recommendation on. Your recommendation is not on the grading ordinance itself, but on the amendment to the zoning regulations that incorporates the same language that's also contained in the grading ordinance, and that language deals with the list of considerations that have now been added that the Commission is to take into account when you do have an application before you. My memo does not get into the other amendments that are being made to the grading ordinance. I'd say the general comment would be we have tried to expand the application of the ordinance to include more sensitivity to environmental impacts, preservation of natural topography, minimization of including regulation of vegetation removal, so we're minimizing any adverse impact on endangered species habitat and things of that nature. We've also added an additional provision to augment the fine if there is some illegal grading performed, if it's shown that that was intentionally done. Right now, it's defined, I believe, as even if it's a misdemeanor, the limits on the city's ability to impose a penalty are governed by the general enforcement provisions of the municipal code. In addition to all of that, what we've done is we've added an additional penalty in this ordinance. So aside from anything else the city has by way of a remedy, we can also slap on an additional $10,000 fine, along with an action for injunctive relief, fines under our normal citation process, and the normal enforcement procedures that we would have available to us. So the penalty that is now included in the grading ordinance is not exclusive of all other enforcement mechanisms and penalties that the city has available to us in the event of any unlawful grading. So with that, I'll be happy to try to answer any questions the Commission may have. Your action tonight is simply to make a recommendation on the proposed amendment to the zoning regulations. You're not being asked to make a recommendation on the overall grading ordinance. That ordinance will go to the City Council, and certainly if you have comments on other provisions as well, we would communicate them back to the Council, but that would not be part of your recommendation as a Planning Commission on the proposed amendment to the zoning ordinance. So, hope that's all clear, but if you have any questions, I'll try to answer.
Thank you. That was clear.
Any questions to the staff?
This is a public hearing. So.
Yes. So we would ask for public comment at this time, or a question?
No, you can ask questions now and then, whatever the chair prefers. You can either open it up for public comment or ask questions now if you have.
Why don't we open it to the public comments first? I have a request from Dana Dilworth to speak. Okay, all three of you.
Thank you, Madam Vice Chair and Commissioners. I'll leave the part out about what Mountain Watch said or did, except to... Glasses? Bigger font, please.
Yeah.
Thank you. So I'll kind of start at the point where there's certain parts of the certain issues about this which aren't within the purview of Mountain Watch, and that the city staff report had not mentioned that the collaboration was a part of a lawsuit because the previous ordinance was not adequate to mitigate certain environmental issues, and I think it may continue to be so. because the city, what I hear in some of this is you're not eligible or licensed to give information to the city engineer. He's also, he or just whomever the person is assigned, is potentially also not competent to handle CEQA issues, know the entire general plan. That's your purview. And so to give up your ability to cover your areas is kind of disturbing to me. So when I say the city engineer is not qualified for responding to environmental issues, these may still be the case, and there should be a mention of the CEQA checklist prior to the city engineer being able to issue a permit. When the city engineer is given the power to require or not require certain components of process, you deny due process to the public. The public has a right to know, and some of these notification procedures are non-existent in this. And you essentially circumvent CEQA. There's no reasoning why grading permits aren't standard throughout the city or what the requirements would be for the Southeast Bayshore, meaning there's an upper slope coming up from the lagoon where Van Water and Rogers is. The Northeast Bayshore along Industrial Way, it's actually adjacent to some HCP properties. Beatty and the Baylands, they're not always going to be planned development. Sierra Point and Crocker Park. All these areas are either adjacent to lands managed by HCP or happen to be owned and managed by Universal Paragon, or like Crocker Park, have upslope areas which might require fully engineered grading. And what I'm speaking to is, and what wasn't, the public didn't hear from the last time the television didn't work, was that I'm concerned about the old Quarry Road because it has divots where it looks like there's going to be a landslide pretty soon if somebody doesn't take some corrective action. And so all of that part of our town which faces in that direction will probably need grading similar to what was done for the school for safety measures. Because we're not doing it proactively, in my opinion. There's no mention of complying with the new state laws that look at global warming and sea level rise. Again, grading in areas not mentioned, like along the lagoon, could also include the center of town, which is former marshland, and will potentially, or at least based on certain predictions, might require a different look at grading. It should include in the Planning Commission's purview and be stronger than just making comments or recommendations to the city engineer. Recent changes in the Planning Commission regulations, which I thought I observed, made you guys a legislative body when they were talking about, changing the language about what the Planning Commission did. So I believe you have the authority to cease operations if they don't comply with the general plan, and things that within your purview but don't necessarily require geotechnical specialists. Then I go through the document and speak about definitions. For city engineer, it implies that a city engineer or their designated agents are qualified licensed professionals. They should be, and it implies it, but it doesn't state it. So it should be articulated here. But there are many different types of engineers, as I've learned dealing with the water board, that, at one point you might be basic civil and some of them are, I don't know, but I know that even on the water board they have 10 different kinds of engineer. And future employees or interim employees may not possess the ability to make a qualified judgment. That should be clarified. Clearing and grubbing doesn't mention doesn't define the word deep or how deep below the ground you could go. Someone could abuse this definition and go tens of feet, 20, 30 feet below, and declare they were just grubbing. Maybe not, but I'm just saying that something needs to be reasonable. Under precautions imposed by the city engineer, in the report it mentions that the city engineer or public works director, and there may be a time when they're not one and the same, so you need to have a provision or mention the qualifications. Discovery of prehistoric, historic, or unique archaeological resources or or human remains, sorry. Define unique, because what's unique to somebody, I know people who go to battle sites and look for cannon stuff, and people who go to Indian sites and look for pottery shards, may not be unique. It might be pretty pervasive, but it still belongs to an architectural or a cultural heritage society like the Native American councils. Other conditions that should stop grading but aren't mentioned here, as in, precautions that could be imposed by a city engineer, would be if they were to expose native asbestos rock, which is called serpentine. That should be spelled out because, not all conditions would be ones that should be ignored. Secondly, the certain water conditions such as artesian effects in springs are a public resource and require greater acknowledgement than an engineering solution to send it off into a nearby waterway, or, if I remember the language used, a subdrain. That the city engineer should not have the burden of making that judgment, that's your level of ability. Under HCP permission required, it says that it should be required just of the lands in the HCP, and I believe it should be lands adjacent to the HCP boundaries as well. And that gives you the opportunity to coordinate greenways, easements, habitat corridors, water features, and the support of protected lands before the grading is done, not after. Also, under the trees, I wondered if it was just street trees that you have the purview of. There are some that aren't listed, that aren't just bay laurel and coast live oak, that should also be on your list of be cautious about, like elderberry, Eastlay cherry, and other trees that provide a food source for migrating birds and animals. There's a mention of removal of invasive species, or actually I don't think there's mentioned, kind of one place but not in the area of 1501-110, that should also mention the removal of the soils that have the seed stalks of the invasive species. When they mention the application, the bonding method should be included in that list. Under interim erosion and sediment control.
I'm sorry, could you explain what the bonding issue is?
Bonding, it says that they can do bonds.
Where is that?
1501-160.
Let us get to that.
Oh, you're trying to follow me.
I am trying to
I am trying to
follow
follow you
you.
to make sense of what you're saying, yes.
Okay, sorry.
1501-160?
160. I just have 16, but then I realized that there were some other numbers there.
If anybody has a
It
page.
just says application form, and I'm just saying it should include bonding.
1.18.
1.18, okay.
Oh, okay.
Got it.
18 or 16.
1501-16 on page H118.
And that's bonding. Where is it?
Okay. It goes 60, 100, 110, 160, so
I believe. Say again, please, what?
Okay, I said 1501-160.
Yep.
It looks like 16, but then I realized just
60.
numerically it should be 160.
Strike out 9-1. And it's number what?
It speaks about the original application. What should be contained in the application? I'm just saying it should include bonding.
Oh, it should include bonding.
Should include bonding
I
in
wonder
that
I couldn't
list.
find bonding on that list.
No,
Okay.
I'm saying
it should
you've
include
got a list of things, but if somebody were to just look there and not know that bonding's required, they might it might get overlooked. Under interim erosion and sediment control plan, should allow the city engineer to require a dust monitoring system that responds to heavy dust conditions in certain projects. And you might do it by the amount of soils that are moved, but wind conditions, because the wind kicks up in the evenings, may exacerbate the dust situations on any place. And, I've been, I pity the people on the Northeast Ridge right now because I see the dust just spewing off the top of the little conveyor belt all day long. And I bet you there's no dust monitoring system around there so that you will not have any records of what the original conditions were and what you had to live through. But and they weren't required before, they won't be required now. So I am saying that citizens need the records of site conditions so that we will know what impacts the dust from large grading may create. There are also laws which state how much, and I just remember them as numbers like TDS or TSS, so I'm assuming that it's total dissolved solids, but it's basically how much dirt is allowed to be flushed through our stormwater systems. But there's no mention here about setting those limits. There's a vague mention about water quality control, but there are also federal laws which should be adhered to. Under security, there should be a provision for 110% of the cost because sometimes the estimates are low. And in the case of DTSC, I asked questions about this on another matter, the bonding. They will not allow the value of the land to be the security of the project. And the reason that is that if somebody were to bolt because of some unforeseen problem, you end up with having to deal with the mess. So you don't necessarily want the land to be what the person uses as the guarantee for getting the work done. Under appeals, this should include a notice to neighbors and interested public interest groups instead of just an appeal to the city manager, and then if you don't like what he says, go to the council. Those are the parts of things that I think deny the public their due process rights. Grading permits and drainage way alterations. There is a Clean Water Act in place, and alterations should be concurrent with CEQA and other federal laws. A city engineer should not be able to waive a permit for this condition. Water is a public trust resource, and the public has the right to be properly noticed of alterations of their resource. This should also include presence of wetlands and disallow any wetland draining without full public knowledge. So I saw nothing in the grading permit that spoke to wet conditions. And for fills, a 1-470 fills C, preparation of the ground, there should be a provision requiring or offering the city or other nonprofit environmental agencies to harvest native plants and the removal of vegetation, topsoil, etc. This is a resource that shouldn't be squandered. Thank you. Yes, you'll get a copy. And I actually have more ideas, but they kind of, everything's said in here, it's just that there are more places that these same things could be popped into.
Did you make reference in your comments to the pertinent parts of this document?
I
That would be
gave,
helpful.
yeah, I gave 1501, 040, 1501, 160,
Okay.
things like that.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Ken? This is Dana.
Good evening, Commissioners. I'm Ken McIntyre. I'm the Executive Director of San Bruno Mountain Watch, and I'm here just to clarify San Bruno Mountain Watch's role in the grading ordinance revision. And I'm not, I didn't really know about the zoning ordinance and how those things fit in. As one of the conditions of a lawsuit settlement in 2006 between San Bruno Mountain Watch and the City of Brisbane, Brisbane's grading ordinance was to be revised with input from San Bruno Mountain Watch. The settlement requirement did not obligate the city to adopt or advocate for the adoption of any of our suggestions, just to discuss and consider them in the course of revising the grading ordinance. Philip Batchelder, the previous Mountain Watch director, and I worked with Hal Topple, Randy Bro, and Clay Holstein on the ordinance revision. Philip, who was involved in the suit that led to the settlement, did most of the work from our end. But I was definitely involved in the several drafts of the new ordinance and all of the meetings. Although not all of the changes we would have liked to have seen went into the grading ordinance proposal, Philip and I both felt that the city staff acted in good faith in working with us and were responsive to our most pressing concerns. Those concerns focus primarily on getting more teeth into the enforcement of the grading ordinance, protection of any areas of habitat value, mitigation for destruction of habitat, and requiring habitat restoration within the HCP, and public safety. We felt that the final ordinance draft was much improved and, in fact, more comprehensive than most that we took a look at from around the state and country. And Philip did most of that. Now, it is up to the Planning Commission and the good citizens of Brisbane to improve this document further, and Dana has done a great job of suggesting things way beyond the scope of what we were doing. And I would encourage you all to take a good look at it. We don't see any reason for it not to apply to all of Brisbane, and eliminating categorical CEQA exemptions would make it still stronger. Thanks.
Thanks.
I'd be happy to answer any questions, but you could also probably speak to Philip if you need to.
Thanks, Ken.
Thank you, Ken.
Michelle?
Michelle Salmon, Brisbane resident, and as one of the good citizens of Brisbane that Ken's referring to, I do have questions and comments about this. I wish it had been updated a while ago, before some of the grading that's taken place recently, but my first and foremost question is about the 250 cubic yard threshold. And I stopped to think about that, and sometimes those terms seem kind of abstract, and I started looking around this room thinking about just how much is 250 cubic
Yeah,
yards.
I was wondering myself.
And I looked at this here, this table here, and I look at it and I think, that's probably not even quite 2 cubic yards. And then you multiply that by 100. 250 cubic yards is a huge amount of dirt. I mean, you guys might know better than I do about like how many truckloads that is. And I guess what I relate it to is when they did the excavation for 110 Sierra Point Road across the street from us, and they basically took out like several dump trucks full of dirt, huge amount of excavating, gigantic, retaining wall. And so I really feel that 250 cubic yards is too high of a threshold. And I think the Planning Commission should be reviewing it if it's more than 50 cubic yards, or probably even more than 20 cubic yards, because when you think about the space you're sitting in, I mean, that's a lot of earth movement in a town like Brisbane where everything's packed in and on a hill, and areas where it's not on a hill. So I really have a problem with the 250 cubic yard kind of threshold. I really think it should be much, much lower than that before the Planning Commission has some kind of oversight into what's happening. I sort of made my notes in a kind of a random order because I wanted to make sure archaeological oversight. That's a big one in Brisbane too, because recently, within the last 5 years, maybe 8 years, probably not even that long, property came up for sale on Sierra Point Road, one lot away from Costaños Canyon. And a couple months ago, I was at some people's house for dinner, and the people who live there now mentioned that, oh yeah, there were all kinds of shells when we excavated for our driveway. And I just went, what? They went right through a mid mound, right through a shell mound, and they had no idea. They had no idea. Where was the archaeological oversight? They just took out a shell mound without anybody ever blinking an eye because they didn't know that it was an archaeological site. How could they know that? But somebody should have known that, and there should have been oversight for that type of a thing. And I don't know how many cubic yards they took out, but they took out a shell mound that was next to a known archaeological canyon, one lot away. So where's the oversight there? And that's of concern. And then in here it defines city engineer or his minions. And I guess I need a better definition of levels of responsibilities and qualifications. Because while right now we have a qualified, city engineer, in certain areas, but as Dana pointed out, different people have different levels of qualifications and knowledge. And Brisbane has a lot of very specific problems, terrains, and conditions that your average Joe Blow is not going to necessarily notice. He may be qualified to do A, but not B. And so I'm concerned about that part too. I'm very concerned about excluding any areas of Brisbane. This should cover all of Brisbane, including the Baylands, including Sierra Point, including areas where we don't think that there are any slopes or what you would consider grading problems or excavation problems. So I don't see why we should exclude any of those areas. I mean, the Baylands has Ice House Hill, and there's all kinds of areas around Brisbane. I don't see why anything should be excluded. So I have a problem with that. And then it talked about the BMPs, best management practices, and it was very specific and cited even a document that's from 2003 that's already 9 years old. So I'd like it to have language about best management practices, latest best management practices, because what was best management practices when they built Lippman School is not best management practices now, and we've learned that the hard way. That cut and fill is not the best way to prepare a site for building. And I'd like to see us really move away from that and move into current best management practices, not archaic ones or ones that have already proved failures in other areas. I did not really understand about the CEQA categorical exemptions, and I'm sure, John, you can enlighten us on that. It probably has something to do with, I don't know what. Why would we exempt? I didn't understand that part at all, so I'd love some clarification on that. Should I keep going down my list and wait, or? And then, does the grading permit include things for grading for yards and additions, and this is where the amount of grading comes into play, because you can really change the typography and the drainage and the flow just by moving, 10 or 20 cubic yards of natural dirt or land or terrain. And even up in the Northeast Ridge area where it is a planned development, it specifically says in their CCNRs that you cannot change the terrain of the backyard. And yet a few years ago, we had a property up there that wanted to do an addition. And that addition to their house, the planning director approved it, and we protested it, and actually it never did get built, but it included changing the terrain of their yard, which changes the engineered drainage of the area. So I have questions about that. And then I wasn't sure what you meant whenever grading is in an HCP area of no more than 250 cubic yards, or what applied there, but I agreed with what Dana said about grubbing and how deep to grub. And just today in the Technical Advisory Committee meeting for the HCP, we talked about, were they talking about 5 millimeters or 5 centimeters when they're talking about scraping an area for habitat restoration. And that makes a huge difference, because this much versus this much depends whether you're scraping off butterfly larvae or not that go underground at certain times of the year. So that really is important to have that clearly defined. And then Dana touched on springs and wetlands. And I think that Brisbane is an area that really has a lot of springs and used to have a lot of secret wetlands. And when you first think of wetlands, you think of marshlands and out on the baylands, or wherever water goes downhill. But when I was growing up, we had a lot of springs and wetlands kind of up on the hill in canyons, and there'd be seeps. And even on Sierra Point Road, where I live, the first block, where I can't think of what the street is, but it doesn't exist as a street, but goes from Solano to Sierra Point and up to Humboldt, and it's a walkway. Well, that used to be all frog habitat when I was a kid. It was a natural seep and a spring that came down through there that's now all been piped and capped and changed and directed elsewhere, and there's no frogs there now. And the property across the street from us that I was talking about, where they did the huge amount of excavation to build the house, well, that had a natural spring. And now the street in front of their house is always wet. They have to have a pump, otherwise their excavated basement or little area for their elevator fills up with water. And for the first time since it was built in 1942 or 41, the house next door to us, which my grandmother built, the basement flooded in a heavy year for the first time in, since 1940? After they built that house and changed the flow of the water through the excavation. So that is a serious issue in Brisbane, and one that needs to be taken into account, not just by an engineer, but maybe by a hydrologist or other types of engineering. And then there was a part here about sample trenching being exempt, and I don't think it should be, because a lot of times to get to the sample trenching, you have to bring in heavy equipment that causes a lot of damage, especially in the sensitive habitat area, like the illegal trenching and sampling that they did on the backside of Tulare Hill last September. So that kind of covers most everything that I had on my hot list. I really appreciate the work you do, and I know that this is a really tough one. Having a really strict, very well oversighted grading ordinance is so important. And I think we have a very good example right now, right here in front of us, how things can go so wrong even if they're supposed to go so right. And that's the disastrous grading problems we've had up at the Northeast Ridge, where they had severe violations of water quality during heavy rains and numerous problems. So your work on this is so very important, however tedious it is. And so I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, there's been several questions. How do we want to go about this? Does anyone have any comments?
I do.
Okay.
I actually share some concerns relative to the city engineer's ability to make aesthetic decisions, or the potential for him to, and I'm not speaking about him personally, I'm speaking about a city engineer. No, none of the planning commissioners are engineers, unless, did you have an engineer? No, yeah.
No.
No.
You know, we have other talents, and I think, you know, the city engineer is looking at things from a safety perspective. That's one part of this puzzle that I think is obviously very important, but I think we should be viewing all applications, so our collective talents can be part of a whole answer and not just part of an answer. So I personally would like to see all grading applications come before us. That's what I would like to see. At least it gives us an opportunity to forestall any potential problems. I mean, you know, we have some environmental expertise through osmosis over many, many years of being involved at that level in the city. You have architectural expertise and you have legal expertise, and that's what our city engineer does not have. I would think that we could add a lot to his perspective before we proceed with any grading.
I have a question for staff, and this is my question. If someone is going to be grading at all around their neighborhood, and it's like they're just going to be changing the grade of their carport, at this point, if it doesn't come before the Planning Commission, are the neighbors actually notified? Because will they actually know that maybe there's going to be a change and they should be watching it because something might happen to their own backyard or their own front yard or their... Is there anything in the provisions for that at this point?
No, I don't believe so. If it's simply a grading permit, I think there's been some confusion between work that requires a permit versus permits that come to the Planning Commission.
Right.
The 250, keep in mind, is only the threshold of applications that come before you.
Right.
Anyone who wants to put a shovel in the ground and move anything beyond 5 cubic feet is going to need a grading permit. There are some exceptions in there, but the actual requirement for the permit is much, much less. Now, that would go to the city engineer. There's no procedure in the existing ordinance or the proposed ordinance that would require on every time someone applies for a grading permit that notice be given to the neighbors. But if there's anything substantial, I would speculate at least that the likelihood is it's in connection with some other type of development application that is more likely to trigger some notice to neighbors.
We have concerned citizens in town who have talked to myself and also one of the council members about a driveway that is being put in where he was not they were not notified, and they're very concerned about water intrusion into their property. And I've heard from him more than once, and which did bring up a question I had. If if someone comes to the planning department or the city engineer to make modifications, they really don't have to contact their neighbors, I suppose. And I mean, this is kind of a city that has lots of lumps in it.
If all they are obtaining is a grading permit, and if it's of an amount that would not trigger review by the Planning Commission, then I do not believe at the present there would be anything that would require notice to the neighbors. I'd have to say it's rare that someone is only getting a grading permit divorced from any other type of land development application, but it is certainly possible. The example you gave about the garage is really an application for a building permit,
Right.
which would include grading. Now, whether that would retrigger notice to neighbors or not, I don't know, but grading is usually one part of a larger development for which other types of entitlements are required, and those entitlements may trigger the need for a public hearing or an application before the Planning Commission. So if you're talking about just grading in isolation of a small amount, and in your example, I'm not sure that would qualify, it sounds like
Right.
more dirt than that would be moved around, then no, there would not be a requirement because that's deemed to be, just a small amount of grading.
Okay.
I have a comment on grubbing and clearing. I actually asked staff today for a definition of clearing and grubbing, and what was read to me was grubbing meaning shallow movement of dirt, but there was no other definition. Can we define it in a better manner?
There is a definition. There is a definition in the ordinance of the phrase. It does not specify any particular depth,
Right.
but that's because that depth may vary depending on the type of vegetation that we're dealing with. I think the whole concept is that you're removing the surface growth, and again, there are restrictions on that. The major change in this ordinance is that under our existing regulations, that would not even be classified as grading. So we're calling it grading, but there are land clearing activities, for example, weed abatement, that might be called grading under this ordinance. And there is, in the definition section, there is a definition of the phrase clearing and grubbing.
Right. Well, I suggest, so what you're saying is which parts of this are we going to be looking at?
Well, a lot of these comments really deal with the substance of the grading ordinance,
Right.
not the amendment to the zoning regulation that the commission has been asked to make a recommendation. So I'm not sure where we go from here, but I did not address the ordinance in general because that was not the matter before you. But you can certainly deal with the language of that proposed amendment, including whether you agree that the definition of areas that are subject to commission review should be defined geographic areas of the city or defined more broadly. You can certainly consider the threshold. That 250 cubic yards is in the existing ordinance and has been there for a long time. So what we're trying to do is basically expand the application of that provision so that the commission is looking at grading applications that you would not normally see. For example, anyone who wants to set foot in the HCP area and start moving dirt around up there is going to be coming before the Planning Commission. That is not a requirement of the existing ordinance. Now, whether it's appropriate to limit certain geographic areas of the city is a judgment of the Commission. You can certainly recommend that it apply to all areas of the city, and that is clearly within your consideration this evening.
Well, why did we separate it out in the first place?
I think the idea is that that's the areas where there could be more potential for an impact. There are areas like on the Baylands where if you take this definition of grading, you're talking about hundreds of thousands of cubic yards that are being moved around out there as part of their earth recycling and earth movement and landfill activities. Now, the city is highly regulating that activity, and it's subject to all sorts of reviews, but it's not a planning issue at this point. It's an engineering question. There are other areas of the city where dirt may be moved around, but it's just too bad the city engineer isn't here because he could probably respond to some of these comments far better than I could. But 250 cubic yards may sound like a lot, and if you apply it to a very confined residential neighborhood, maybe it is. You take that amount and you put it on the Baylands, that wouldn't even make a dent in the amount of dirt that they're moving out there on a daily basis. So it really depends on what we're dealing with. What we tried to do was to find the areas of the city that seem to be most sensitive to that quantity of material and not include areas where moving dirt around is not going to have that much of an impact. Now, whether we're on the mark or not is a matter for the commission to decide, but that's at least the staff recommendation at this point, and you're certainly free to go with it or suggest something else.
May I ask a question? The grubbing that was done below Tulare, how much cubic feet of dirt was moved? Does anybody have a clue?
I have absolutely no information on that, but we could always find out, I guess.
I don't have the yardage, but that was a case where, again, it was certainly not considered an exempt activity. It was required a grading permit, a site activity review, and several fines imposed by both the county and Fish and Wildlife Service because of the damage that was done to that site. So in terms of the activity and whether it would have been, there's no circumstance under that would have been considered exempt activity under previous rules or these rules or any rules.
That would have come before the Planning Commission?
I don't know if the activity, I'm not sure if the yardage would have exceeded 250 cubic yards or not. But it would be, under the new rules, I believe that's within the HCP area, it would have been subject to, under the new rules, yes, it would be subject to commission review.
Keep in mind that even if a grading activity is not under your review, that doesn't mean it can be conducted without a permit. So, like I said, there's a very broad definition of grading in this ordinance, broader than what we have now. And so the fact that it's not coming before the commission for review does not mean that someone can simply go out there and grade to their heart's content without some kind of a permit. And that threshold is fairly low. So whether the 250 is appropriate or whether the cutoff is appropriate, that's really the question before the commission this evening. But wherever you draw the line, unless as suggested you include every permit that's ever issued, comes before the commission. The fact that you're not reviewing it doesn't mean that it's exempt from a permit.
Okay, so let's go back to what we are supposed to be looking at. So we are not supposed to be looking at the whole document. Is that correct? We are supposed to be looking at page 1.
Down at the end.
H17, is that correct?
I think on page 10, of the ordinance itself, which defines the circumstances under which commission review is triggered, that's an appropriate subject for your review and comment, and then the actual considerations that are taken into account, which is the amendment to the zoning ordinance at the end of the draft on page 44.
And on page...
Now, I don't mean to suggest you can't make comments in other parts of the ordinance, but what I'm saying is that technically...
Wait a minute,
your
you're talking about H110, or I'm getting confused.
Okay, on page...
There's two sets of numbers here.
There's this other label. Which one we labeled?
Oh, I'm sorry, your paging is different, I guess.
Oh, okay.
Therein lies the problem.
A little confused.
All right. So, you're talking English and I'm talking French.
Yes.
Here we are. No, it's
49.
10.
Yeah, my page.
Page 49.
49?
No.
Yeah, I was referring to the page 10 of the ordinance itself.
Page 10, which would be
your H.1.15.
15.
Yes.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, we're agreeing.
Yeah. So at the top of that page lists the circumstances under which an application for a permit would be subject to commission review.
Okay.
Paragraph B are the considerations that are to be taken into account by the commission.
So you
Paragraph B is the same as the proposed amendment to the zoning regulation. So the zoning regulation does not address the subject of when does something come before you for review. That's in the grading ordinance. When it does come before you for review, then both the grading ordinance and the zoning regulation list out the considerations that are taken into account.
Okay, so page H121, we're not going to do any, we're not going to look at it at all? Or,
And then the other page is
okay, so
H.1.93.
H.1.93.
Actually, it does.
Like
H here about.
Does it?
93.
For,
Page.
it doesn't just reference this. Yeah,
Uh-huh.
And that's number B?
20?
Okay, that's 17.32.220.
Page 93.
Not in my draft.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is.
Mm-hmm.
That's interesting, 'cause in this one,
All right. May I read something?
okay.
On page H.1.15, A, Section 2, grading is to be performed on any parcel of land within the boundaries of the HCP, provided, however, review by the Planning Commission shall not be required if only grading operation to be conducted is weeding or clearing and grubbing, where such work is performed pursuant to an HCP site activity approval by the plan operator. If somebody is going to be clearing, my question here is relative to the potential access to that area. If they're bringing in large equipment, potentially running over sensitive areas. Am I confused on this?
Yeah, that's part of the site activity review that the county plan manager would have to...
For any of these areas?
Yeah, for example, the thing we had in mind here is that the fire department routinely conducts weed abatement up in those areas, and that contractor who performs that work first goes to the county and gets a site activity review. That review includes the means of access of getting there and how the operation is conducted. So from our point of view, that's really for weed abatement. There are habitat concerns, and that's the function of the county plan operator to address those concerns, and there are usually mitigation measures that are part of that operation. So that would include how are they going to get there. They're not going to go plow a new road into the area.
Right. Well, I can actually speak to this a little bit because I'm one of the volunteers that works with the fire department on the mountain. And last year, I actually stopped quite a few trees from being cut down that they were unaware should probably have been left alone. So I'm a little nervous about this. I mean, I was up there for 5 days in a row with these guys, and we were stopping them cutting down certain trees that didn't, oh, I didn't know that was a so-and-so tree. Well, that's a native. Why don't you just leave it alone and up-limit? So I'm just a little nervous about this.
Well, maybe that's an issue that ought to be addressed with the county in terms of their site review. If they're not aware of what they should or should not be doing, then...
Well, that would mean that the people in charge of the clearing, and in this case we're using prisoners to do a lot of that work, would have to be educated in the vegetation that's up there.
No,
I think we're getting into maybe, I think you're pointing out a very realistic operational consideration
Right.
in terms of who's actually doing the work and maybe their qualification to actually adequately implement whether it be a plan approved by the Planning Commission or a plan approved by the county under a site activity review, I don't think the approval process is going to address your concern if the actual operators are not qualified. So I think that's probably a management question of who's supervising them, whether it's the county or whether it's our fire department. That's probably an operational question that this ordinance language isn't going to really help because, again, if it doesn't matter if it's a planning commission approved plan or approved by the county, if it's not being implemented one way or the other, there's no solution until the operator actually follows the approved plan.
Okay, can we just make a note of that somewhere, please?
Can I speak to that issue, actually?
Please come forward.
I'm sorry, this issue actually came up today. After the TAC, I mentioned to Sam Hertzberg, who happens to be the county plan operator, about the violations that were done by the Toll Brothers on the recent Northeast Ridge, which is in the HCP area. And he said, that's not under my jurisdiction. The city granted that permit. It's on them. So it's kind of like, okay, so you're right to be concerned about that, Karen, because the county does not have the bandwidth to go out there and supervise all of the permits that have been issued in the city of Brisbane for grading, regardless of whether it's in the habitat or not. And so, I mean, if it's they'll issue a site activity review and saying, okay, your plan looks good, but they don't do any oversight after that. They just issue the permit based on the plan, and the oversight is really on whoever issued the permit, and that would be us, the city of Brisbane. And so it is a really area of concern because, you know, it's a hot potato and nobody wants to hold it in their hand and shepherd the process through. And that's exactly, that's a problem. So I don't know what to say about that one, but that's a concern. So thank you for bringing that up.
So what I'm hearing from some people here is on page 10, number B, that we would want to change the language to saying not necessarily only Brisbane Acres, Southwest Bayshore, Central Brisbane, North Ridge, Northeast Ridge, Northwest Bayshore, or the Quarry, but shall include areas in Crocker Park that may be on a slope, or, I mean, how would we?
Well, that could pertain to anywhere in town.
That's true.
If you've got a lot of grading, and we've got, what, 6 buildable lots left in town. They're all uphill lots, which will require a lot of grading if permits are ever issued to build them. Is that correct, John? We say there was 6 buildable lots?
That would be considered Central Brisbane.
Yeah, I'm not sure about the number. It's a fairly limited number, but again, as the chair has pointed out, Central Brisbane is one of those areas that are subject to commission review. So you're talking about, you know,
So
look at what areas are excluded.
Yeah, okay.
So this would be excluding Crocker Park. I think Dana Dilworth has it in her. What?
Why would we want to exclude anything except for the already permitted activity of moving dirt around?
If you're going to talk in the microphone.
I wonder why we would exclude anything except the already permitted activity of moving dirt around at the dirt recycling place on the Baylands. Better to cover it all and then exempt certain activities that don't make sense to be covered. And so if I could, I would recommend that the changes that you should make or under your purview to make would be no more than 2 cubic yards of material instead of 250 cubic yards of material, and that you wouldn't exclude anything under the parcels of land, and then with the exception of certain permitted activities like moving the dirt around at the Baylands, and that under Section A.2, supervised by a city-approved biological expert in terms of grading in the habitat or grubbing in the habitat or anything else in the habitat, since the county doesn't have the resources to oversee that.
By a city-approved, what?
Yeah, and paid for by whoever's doing the grading. And so that we have, like, if you're going to be doing the type of weed removal or whatever you're talking about, that you have a biologist or a vegetation expert on site saying, no, that's a buckeye tree, don't remove it, or depending on what the activity is.
Is that actually legal?
Is it legal to have?
No, I'm asking our city attorney, is to put something in as Michelle said, would that actually be a legal situation?
I'm not sure I fully understood the suggestion. For starters, you're saying 2 cubic yards.
No, yeah.
Does that mean that the commission is going to look at everything that's more than 2 cubic yards, in which case you're going to have a pretty heavy agenda? We do have requirements for biologic assessments when there's a development application. I'm not quite sure how she was suggesting it be applied in this instance. If you have someone who is simply doing, a small amount of grading, are they going to then be required to go out and get a biologist? Are we going to require a biologist every time we want to do weed abatement? And what effect is that going to have on the program? I think, we're raising larger issues here that would require input not only from the city engineer, but now at this point the fire department, because all of those costs are charged to the property owner. And if they're not paid, they're, put as a lien on the property. So, I'm not sure where we're headed with this, but we do require biologic assessments on land development applications. So
I'm actually talking about more of the section in the HCP, like the grubbing and that type of thing. And the on-site vegetation expert, it could be that, one of the fire department crew becomes a city-certified vegetation expert. It doesn't have to be someone with a PhD. I'm talking about someone who's got on-the-ground knowledge, agreed-upon knowledge of what we're doing out there, instead of sending out a crew of prisoners to clear the land with no oversight by anybody who knows what the heck they're doing. And it doesn't, so I'm not saying it has to be costly, I'm just saying it has to be reasonable oversight by a city-sanctioned, expert in what they're doing. And the expert could be, could be Karen.
Well, I'm not suggesting there's not a need for an oversight. What I'm not clear of is to what extent are we dealing with an administrative problem versus a legislative problem.
Right.
As John pointed out, there may be some problems between the issuance of a site activity review and the guy out there doing the work. And certainly it's our expectation when the county reviews this and does its review that there's also going to be supervision of the work. Now, if that's not happening, then there's some issues that we need to raise with the county and try to work out a process. If that means we need to amend the ordinance, that's fine, but I guess my concern would be to be rushing toward an amendment before we've had a clear definition of the problem. Maybe we need to sit down with the county and review their procedures in more detail so that someone like Karen doesn't need to go out there and make sure a tree isn't cut down that shouldn't be.
Yeah, it was actually a shock. So it was very
Well, that shouldn't happen, and you're absolutely right. So the question really is what's occurring between the county review and the performance of the work. And it sounds like some revisiting of that whole process needs to take place, and that may prompt some need to change the language of the ordinance, but I wouldn't want to work backwards and assume we know what the problem is before we've defined it.
Although we have seen the problem exhibit itself several times, Hal, with site activity review and a site activity review is they go out, they look at the site, or they know the site, they look at the operator's plan, and they say, okay, we're good to go, but the City of Brisbane is the permit issuer who has oversight of whether that has been done according to the plan that they reviewed.
I also am concerned because now I think that people don't have to come and actually talk to a human being. This can actually be done back and forth via, just through a computer. People can, a permitting process. I'm saying, there's more than one human being on each side, but it's not like a face-to-face situation. And I think things can kind of get lost in the, I'm sorry, John.
Let's all agree that we're all in agreement on objective here.
Right.
And I don't think there's any disagreement of the objective of the city staff and working with Mountain Watch and with the others, that our goal here was to protect the HCP and to protect the habitat. Mm-hmm. It sounds like there have been some, administrative glitches in that process as it's been conducted in the past. And I think that merits some further investigation on our part, maybe sitting down with the county. I don't like hearing that the county says, well, that's the city's problem, when they issued the site activity review. Now, if they don't have the capability to follow up with that review and make sure that their conditions are implemented, then that's an issue we need to address. The city may issue a grading permit, but if clearing and grubbing is exempt from a permit, then we're really relying on the county to protect the habitat, which is really their job as the plan operator. And if that job isn't being performed properly, then I think there are some, administrative things to be sorted out. So from what I've heard tonight, I think we've got some issues that need to be addressed. I'm just not sure to what extent they need to be addressed legislatively.
In this document?
Yes.
Okay, the second question is the amount of cubic yards.
Okay, can we get a visual on 250 cubic yards?
Yes.
I need a visual.
I can help on that.
Thank you.
So 250 cubic yards, if I'm not mistaken, is about, on a standard buildable 5,000 square foot lot, would mean about just under 1.5 feet of soil covering the entire lot. So
that's a lot of soil.
So on a 5,000. So it's like 100 by 50 feet, like this.
By 2 feet deep.
By 2
feet deep.
No, right, under 2 feet.
Okay, so
Under 2 feet.
100 feet by 50 feet.
On a 5,000 square foot lot, which is our standard kind of buildable lot.
So 100 feet by 50 feet by 2 feet deep.
Yeah.
Approximately.
Right.
That's a lot of dirt.
That's a lot of dirt.
Can we change that number? That's why I needed the visual on it. That's a lot of dirt.
That's more dirt than what would fit in this room.
No.
Is
Right.
it about the amount that would fit in this room?
No.
No.
No, because, right, isn't it like 5,000 square foot lot? Yeah, this room is much smaller than, let's see, 100, yeah, this room is much smaller.
Okay, in cubes, in a big square thing, what does 250 cubic yards look like? Come on, math boys. Don't look at you. I'm a word person. I'm a word person, too.
I think if,
I don't think you can fit it in this room.
So it'd be more than this room. It would be about
no,
this room.
how large is this room? Roughly.
40 by 30? Ken, you got an answer? A lot of word people over there, no math people.
Well, just think of like 1 cubic yard is 3 by 3 by 3.
I know. I think we need this visual.
So 50 by 50 foot room would be just under 3 feet high.
That's a lot of dirt. I think we need to change that number. I think we need to consider changing that number.
And we can consider to change that one? Sure.
Thank you, Helen.
That's what we wanted to know.
We could reduce it to, roughly like half that.
100.
So it
100?
would be using the original, like, 2,500 square foot lot at 1.5 feet.
Right, because even if we're talking about uphill driveways and 100 cubic feet of dirt, that still has the potential to change the drainage to the downhill lots. Or conversely, if somebody below is digging out 100 cubic feet of dirt, it has the potential to destabilize the property above, to the left, to the right, whatever, regardless of slope, right?
Well, you're absolutely correct theoretically, but what kind of a question are you raising? You're raising, first of all, an engineering question and then a geologic or geotechnic question. And what we're talking about on the 250 is what applications come to the Planning Commission. Now, when it comes to the commission, are you going to be then looking to the city engineer to determine where the drainage flow is going to go, what the slope stability is going to look like? And those are engineering questions that he would be addressing in any case. It doesn't matter what the quantity is. As soon as you start digging into the hill, you're going to need a grading permit, and the city engineer is going to have to deal with drainage, slope stability, and all of the other engineering questions.
Right.
So the number we're talking about is the number that triggers Planning Commission review. It is not the number that triggers engineering review.
Right.
And if those are what your concerns are we going to have a Planning Commission hearing only for the sake of listening to the city engineer who's going to be going through that kind of review anyway?
So
I think the reason for the change that we're suggesting is we were trying to put the commission's focus on planning type of issues and environmental kinds of issues, not engineering and geotechnic issues. So where you draw the line, is up to you. But I think the distinction has to be kept in mind between what you feel comfortable reviewing and what the city engineer has been trained to review. And you really want to deal with the issue as well. Is that cut going to destabilize the hill? And is the Planning Commission the best body to make that determination?
Well, that brings me back to my original comment then, that the city engineer has his group of talents and we have a separate one. So it's not just geotechnical or it has other issues from my perspective of aesthetics, and 250 cubic yards to a neighbor might be...
Commissioner Wu has something to say.
I think Hal raises a really good point, and I'm feeling like I really need contextual clarification and understanding of the source and the rationale for the 250 cubic feet, because you're right, there's a distinction between the actual application, right, and the planning portion. The planning portion being our responsibility and purview, and then the geological and the engineering portion belonging to the city engineer. Having said that, I feel like there's a crossover, and I'm not sure where that crossover is, and I'm thinking 250 cubic yards is still too much for my comfort zone. And so I was wondering if we can get contextual clarification, understanding before we move forward with the suggestions in this amendment. That, and then also if the city engineer could possibly attend our next hearing so that we can actually discuss some of these questions and get clarification.
On them and drag them here if necessary. All I can say about the 250 is that it's strictly historical. That was in the ordinance when I...
And that's concerning because I'm not sure. Right. And that's concerning because I'm not sure if that's applicable anymore, the rationale for the 250 as the minimum.
Yeah, it's a perfectly legitimate question, and if you say, well, what is the rational basis for it, about all I can say is that was there when we all came on board. So it certainly is a legitimate subject of discussion, and again, I keep thinking I keep trespassing into the city engineer's area of expertise on some of these questions.
And I also think that going back to what the relevant concerns that were raised by the community tonight, those questions and concerns cannot be incorporated until we have that conversation and define the issue that we're really all we're all coming at from different angles and different perspectives, but until we clearly define what we're all trying to resolve, we're not going to be able to go there, and I'm uncomfortable not incorporating the relevant concerns of the community tonight.
We're putting our little math brains together here, and one way of visualizing about 256 cubic yards would be a pile of dirt that's 24 by 24 by 12 feet tall. So that's about 256 cubic yards.
That's a lot of dirt.
25 by 25 by...
Yeah.
You can check.
Through the chair, I came up with a similar but different division of it. So if you looked at, I was trying to imagine the height of the room at about 15, maybe. By 30, I just kind of rough pasted it. Might be 35 wide. So 15 by 30 by 15 would be another dimension. So if the width of the room is actually 35, you'd probably come out maybe more like 10 feet out to about the edge of the dais. So
Wait a minute, so you're saying this whole room?
So if you filled up to the ceiling and wall to wall, it'd come out probably about 10 feet from the back wall out to about the edge of the dais.
So we would be buried.
You'd be buried, so you'd have to move first. Sorry about that visual. I should have been that side of the room. Nothing personal.
Yeah, over there, perhaps. Well, no, that's actually
Right.
very helpful.
Yeah, so
Well-
it comes out and
What I would like
About
to suggest that we invite our city engineer to come to our next meeting, and also I really do want to thoroughly look at the comments from our from the public. I think that I want to spend some time looking at that, and when we walked into this, I really did not have a lot of clarity about what parts we were supposed to be able to work on, so that's helpful. And what do the rest of you feel?
I
agree.
concur. I think
Yeah.
we need time to look at these.
I mean, it was evident that the roles were being defined more clearly, and I thank the Mountain Watch and the city staff for going through that, because it's tedious. But there were some clarification, kind of issues with the cubic yards, and then also like the grubbing. There's this 15% coverage, like how did the 15% come up as well? So,
Right.
But I wanted to make sure that we're responding to the right part of this document, the amendment on our role.
Now, one question that was brought up was how deep grubbing actually is, and that's not within our area to make decisions on, or it is? I'm not really clear what we can actually make decisions on.
It is within the definition of the large ordinance, but I do think just so that we all can deal with this subject, it probably would be time well spent just to try to get some clarification of that term. That definition, as I recall, came from the city engineer, so, and I know he was trying to maintain some flexibility because the amount you go down is going to vary with the site, but
Right.
I think it's difficult to deal with the ordinance in general, in particular, the issues that you're dealing with without understanding the language that we're using.
Right.
So,
And then also, it seemed as though we need some more clarification on the role of, what Karen brought up, where this, is there any way we can write into this ordinance a way to have more oversight of the actual work being done? If the county is not going to really want to oversee it, and it's, is there any way we can follow up on that?
I think in general the answer to that is yes, but I would be reluctant to start writing something before we have a clear understanding of the problem. what we're trying to fix. Now, it could be that working out better procedures with the county will deal with it. It could be that we need to set up some whole process for additional professional expertise to be brought on board and not rely on the county to some degree. I don't know, but I'm open to any of those solutions, but I think we need to have some dialogue with the county first to find out what they are doing, what we expect that they are doing, and what's really happening out in the field. And then we can figure out where to go from there. There could be a legislative solution to it. I'm just not quite sure what it is at this point.
Well, I do believe that the city is committed to the mountain that we live on. I think that it's pretty clear. I mean, we even have a mountain watch. And so as much as possible, I would like to see us all work in conjunction so that we can preserve it to the best of our abilities. And, I think we're all pretty committed to that. This is our mountain. We are living on it. And so, any way we can help that, either through this particular document or in other ways, I'd like to see that.
Maybe the thing to do is, certainly continue this to your next meeting. We'll sit down with the city engineer. We will try to have some discussion with the county in the meantime. And we can put it on the agenda. If we're not ready to come back, we can let you know. But I think some legitimate concerns have been raised here, and I think at least the areas that you're dealing with have been a little better defined in terms of questions that you've raised, the areas of the city that need to be included, what should be the quantity limit, where did the 250 come from, and do we still need that number or something less than that? If less than that, then what? And I think also that gives us some time to go back to the calculators and get you some better graphics
I was
on what
trying, and I was
250
not,
means.
I was not doing so well.
I really do want to thank, our citizens who have come forward to help us with this. I appreciate that, and if more want to come, we certainly would welcome them. I mean, we need all the help we can get. Does anyone else have anything to say?
Nope, thank you.
Okay.
I agree.
Let me find my agenda.
Hey, Madam Chair, if you could continue the public hearing to the next meeting, so we'll have a date certain. February 14th.
Yes.
I'm looking for my
Love.
agenda.
A lovely day.
Mine's your agenda. Does anybody have an agenda? I seem to have misplaced my agenda.
No, mine's all on my computer.
Pass it to me.
I'm sorry. So I would like to continue this public hearing to the next meeting, which will be February 14th, 2013. Next, we will go to, is there anything else more initiated by staff?
Just one item. Ken handed out something from your rules of procedure, just to remind the commission that your selection of officers will be your next meeting, the first meeting in February. So just wanted you to be aware of that.
You can pass it back. I found it. All right, items initiated by the commission. Are there any reports of subcommittee meetings?
One quick update. For the Sustainability Committee, our next meeting, we had to move it to, I believe, February 6th or 7th, still being decided, to finish up an edit of one more item on the document, so before it moves back to City Council.
Anything else?
Almost done.
Nope. All right, next I will adjourn to the regular meeting of February 14th, 2013, and thank you very much. Thank you again, Margaret, for coming and speaking with us, and it's good to see you back, Hal. I hope you had a good vacation.
Wish you were still there now? Wish you were still there.
Oh, it's nice to be able to drink the water again.
Well, thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you.